The town with a rule nobody explains. There's a town about 3 hours from where I grew up where every single business closes at 8 p.m. sharp, without exception, and every resident is inside their home with their doors locked by 8:15. Nobody in town will tell you why. I spent 11 days there in the fall of my last year of college, and by the third night, I understood exactly why nobody wanted to talk about it. By the end of this video, I'm going to tell you exactly what happens in that town after 8:15 p.m., because I saw it. Not heard about it. Saw it, from a window I wasn't supposed to be looking out of. But before I get there, I need to explain how I ended up in a town most people have never heard of and never will, because the way I got pulled into all of this matters just as much as what I eventually found out. I was finishing my last semester of college, and I needed a specific kind of location for a documentary short, something rural, something that felt untouched by time. A professor mentioned a town 2 counties over that fit exactly what I was looking for. Small. Quiet. Barely on any map that wasn't hyperlocal. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he'd driven through it once and left before nightfall because something about the place felt like it was waiting for something. I laughed it off at the time. I don't laugh about it anymore. I drove in on a Tuesday afternoon in October, camera equipment in the trunk, planning to stay maybe 4 or 5 days. The town itself was smaller than I expected: one main street, a diner, a hardware store, a church with a bell tower you could see from almost anywhere in town, and maybe 200 houses total spread out from the center. The first thing I noticed, even before I found a place to stay, was how early everything seemed to be preparing to close. It was barely 3 p.m., and shop owners were already stacking chairs, locking secondary doors, bringing in outdoor signage, the kind of end-of-day routine you'd expect at 7:45, not the middle of the afternoon. I found a bed and breakfast run by a woman named Eleanor, who I'd guess was in her late 60s, sharp and polite but with a kind of watchfulness in the way she looked at me that I didn't understand yet. She gave me a room, gave me a key, and then, almost as a footnote to the check-in process, told me something that has stuck with me ever since. Doors locked by 8:15. No exceptions, dear. Even for guests. I asked why, mostly out of politeness, expecting some story about a curfew ordinance or a old town rule nobody enforces anymore. She just smiled, the kind of smile that isn't really an answer, and said, "You'll understand by the end of the week." For the first 3 days, nothing happened. I want to sit on that, because it's important. Most videos like this jump straight to the terrifying part, but what actually unsettled me first wasn't anything supernatural. It was how uniform everyone's behavior was. Every single business in town, without a single exception I could find, closed by 8 p.m. Not closed early that day, closed every day, every single one, like clockwork. I filmed some establishing shots on my second evening and caught, on camera, 3 separate shop owners locking their doors at almost the exact same minute, without any visible communication between them. By 8:15, the streets were completely empty. Not quiet, empty. No cars. No porch lights left on outside. Every house I could see from Eleanor's front porch had its curtains drawn and, as far as I could tell, its doors locked. I asked a few people around town, casually, why the rule existed. I got variations of the same non-answer every time. An older man at the hardware store told me, "It's just how it's always been." A woman at the diner told me, "You get used to it," in a tone that suggested she very much had not gotten used to it, not really. Nobody was rude about it. Nobody acted frightened, exactly. They acted like people discussing something mundane and unpleasant, like a chore they'd rather not talk about. By my third night, I'd started to notice something else. Nobody asked me why I was curious. In a town this small, an outsider filming a documentary should have generated at least some gossip, some questions. Instead, people treated my presence with a strange kind of careful neutrality, like they were being deliberately unremarkable around me. On my 4th night, I made a decision I regretted almost immediately. I stayed out past 8:15. It wasn't intentional, not at first. I'd been filming a long exposure shot of the church bell tower from across the street, and I lost track of time. By the time I checked my watch, it was 8:09. Eleanor's B&B was a 12-minute walk. I remember doing the math in my head and thinking I could make it if I hurried. I didn't make it. At 8:15 exactly, every remaining light on the street shut off at once. Not gradually, simultaneously, like a switch had been thrown for the entire town. I was standing in the middle of the sidewalk, camera equipment slung over one shoulder, completely alone under a sky that had gone fully dark, in a town where I now realized I couldn't see a single lit window in any direction. I started walking faster. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, but wrong, too even, too deliberate, like something pacing itself rather than walking normally, coming from somewhere behind me on the street. I didn't turn around. I don't fully know why, except that some instinct told me turning around was exactly the wrong thing to do. I made it back to the B&B at 8:23. Eleanor was standing in the doorway, already holding it open, her face unreadable. She pulled me inside, locked the door behind me, 3 separate locks, I noticed, not just one, and didn't say anything about how close I'd cut it. She just said, very quietly, "You're lucky you were close." That night, after everything had gone quiet again, Eleanor sat with me in the kitchen and told me part of the story. The first real explanation anyone in town had given me. She said the town had always had something that comes through after dark. Not every night, she was careful to specify, but consistently enough, and unpredictably enough, that the entire town had organized itself around avoiding any exposure to it. The 8:15 rule wasn't official, wasn't written into any law. It was just something every family in town taught their children, generation after generation, the same way you'd teach a child not to touch a hot stove. I asked her what it actually was. She said she didn't know, not exactly, that almost nobody in town had ever actually seen it and lived to describe it clearly. What she did know was this: it didn't attack the town's homes. It never had, not once in the town's recorded history. It only affected people who were outside after the town went dark. I asked her why nobody had ever tried to leave, permanently, to escape it entirely. She looked at me for a long moment before answering. Some do. Most come back within a few years. It's easier to live around something you understand than to spend your life wondering if you escaped it, or if it simply hasn't found you again yet. That answer didn't satisfy me. It should have. Instead, it made me more determined to actually understand what I was dealing with. A decision that, looking back, was almost certainly a mistake. Over the next few days, I used the town's small local archive, really just a single room above the library, maintained by a volunteer, to look into the town's history. I was looking for anything, old newspaper clippings, historical society notes, anything that might explain when this rule started and why. What I found was fragmented, but consistent. References going back over a century to the After Dark incidents, described vaguely enough in official records that I suspected deliberate omission rather than simple lack of documentation. A handful of names of residents who had, over the decades, been reported missing after being out later than they should have been, always described in the same careful, euphemistic language. Did not return home. Last seen near the town limits after dark. The most recent entry I found was from just 6 years earlier, a teenager, 17 years old, who had gone missing after staying out past the town's unofficial curfew during a dare with friends. The record noted he was found 3 days later, roughly 2 miles outside town, alive but unable to account for the missing time, and that he'd left the town permanently with his family less than a month after being found. I wanted to talk to that family. Eleanor told me, when I asked, that they'd moved out of state and that nobody in town had heard from them since. On my 5th night, I made a choice that I still can't fully justify, even now. I wanted to see it. Not experience it directly, I wasn't reckless enough for that, or so I told myself, but I wanted to observe from somewhere I believed was safe, the second-floor window of my room at the B&B, facing the main street, well after the town had gone dark. At first, nothing. The street was as empty and silent as every other night. Around 9:40, that changed. I saw movement near the church at the far end of the street, not a person walking, exactly, but something moving with a rhythm that didn't quite match how a person moves. It moved down the center of the street, slowly, pausing at intervals in front of different houses, as if checking something, before continuing on. I want to be honest about the limits of what I actually saw, because I think that honesty matters more than exaggerating it for effect. From that distance, in that darkness, I couldn't make out a clear shape. What I can tell you is that it was tall, taller than any person I've seen, and that its movement had a stillness to it between steps that felt deliberately unnatural, like it was allowing itself to be seen moving normally and then correcting itself. It stopped directly in front of the B&B. I don't know how long it stood there. Time genuinely stopped feeling reliable to me in that moment. What I do remember clearly is that it turned, not its body, just what I assume was its head, toward the second-floor window where I was standing. I stepped back from the glass. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. The next morning, Eleanor didn't ask me if I'd seen anything. She already knew. She told me, calmly, over breakfast, that she'd heard me get up in the night, and that she'd known exactly what that meant the moment she heard my footsteps near the window. "It knows now that you've seen it," she said. "That's different from just being new in town." I asked what that meant, practically. She told me it meant I needed to be more careful than I had been, that the 8:15 rule mattered for everyone, but it mattered more for anyone it had specifically noticed. I finished my documentary footage over the next 3 days, staying inside well before dark every single night, taking no further risks. On my 11th day, I packed my car and left before noon, telling myself I'd never come back. I want to close the main story with something that happened almost 2 years after I left that town, because I think it matters to how you understand everything I've just told you. I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Eleanor. I hadn't given her my number when I left. She'd apparently gotten it from the university, through channels I still don't fully understand. She told me, without much preamble, that a resident had reported seeing something near the town limits that matched a description of someone who used to live in town decades earlier, someone who had gone missing under the exact same after-dark circumstances, back when Eleanor herself was a child. She said she wasn't calling to frighten me. She was calling because she wanted me to know that whatever it was, it didn't only take people. Sometimes, she said, it seemed to return them. Years later, changed in ways nobody in town had ever been able to fully explain. I asked her if the person seemed all right. She was quiet for a moment before she answered. "They don't seem to know how much time has passed," she said. "They think it's still the year they went missing." I've thought about that town more than almost anything else that's happened to me, and there are a few things about it that I still can't reconcile. 1. The entire town organized its daily rhythm, for at least a century, around avoiding contact with something nobody could clearly describe. That level of sustained, intergenerational discipline suggests whatever they were avoiding was consistent and real enough to be worth that level of collective sacrifice, generation after generation, without the rule ever being formally written down or legally enforced. 2. It never touched the homes. Only people caught outside after dark. Which means it wasn't indiscriminate, there was some kind of boundary it respected, or was bound by, that the town had learned through what must have been generations of loss before the rule was fully understood and followed. 3, and this is the one that unsettles me most, even now, it noticed me. Specifically. Eleanor's reaction the next morning wasn't generic caution. It was the reaction of someone who understood that something had shifted, that I was no longer simply an outsider passing through, but someone the town's specific, unexplained presence was now aware of. And 4, the returned. The idea that whatever this is doesn't only take people, but occasionally gives them back, unstuck from time in a way nobody can explain or reverse, is the detail I still think about most. It reframes the entire situation from something purely predatory into something closer to a kind of collection, patient, unhurried, indifferent to how long it takes. I've never gone back. I don't plan to. But I think about that town, and that rule, more often than I'd like to admit. If this one got under your skin, that's exactly the kind of story I want to keep telling on this channel. If you've ever visited a place, a town, a neighborhood, even just a single house, that had a rule nobody could fully explain, but everyone followed anyway, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments, or send it through the submission link in the description. The next Nightloop tale is built entirely from stories sent in by people like you. Subscribe if you want to be here for that one. And if you're ever driving through a small town and notice everything closing early, maybe don't stay past dark to find out why.